Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning, good morning. So I think we had a few little technical challenges, but we'll give a minute for people to get back on. Good morning, Harriet Mazansky in the holy city of New York. We're so glad that you're a click away.
How are you?
So good to see everybody. So we are working our way through the Netanyahus, and I had sent, I think on Friday, an email about chapters 4 and 5, which are such an interesting companion pair of chapters because the focus is so different. Chapter 5 is the putative voice of an Israeli professor at Hebrew University who speaks quite eloquently about the question that's at the heart of this whole project. Why is it that the son of Zion, Ben Zion, the son of Zion, Ben Zion Netanyahu, the son of Zion, who is God's gift, why is he outside of Israel during the formative stage of Israel? Why is it that he is in America? Why is he getting his degree? If everyone can put their mute on, why is it that he's getting his degree at Dropsy College? And what is Dropsy College anyway? And why is it that he is teaching at Cornell, which is a fine institution, but here he is, the son of Zion, God's gift, Ben Zion Netanyahu. What is he doing in Cornell for 20 years? And you might remember one year in one of Bibi's electoral victories, Micha Goodman came to town and he was speaking about why Bibi always wins. And Micha pointed out that Bibi's entire appeal is that he's an outsider. He's an outsider to Israel, and that really, I mean, you know the drill in America, how the outsider, I'm not an incumbent, I'm new to politics, I'm an outsider to politics, how that had appeal and currency, and his basis for that was that his father.
You know what, Al? I'm going to just send you the link,
was
okay?
excluded.
No,
If everybody can please put on your
hang up.
mute,
I'm going to
please.
send it to you right now, okay?
If everyone can please put on your mute. And maybe Caitlin or John, whoever is.
Sherry?
If everyone can please put on your mute. So this chapter 5 answers the question, why was Bibi's father Ben Zion such an outsider in Israel? And in the course of that, there's kind of further exploration, which we'll talk about this issue of politicizing the Jewish past and using it for political advocacy in the Jewish present. And it's a kind of a continuation of our conversation from last week about if you see a straight line from the pogroms through the Spanish Inquisition, through the Cossacks, through Khmelnytsky, through Kishinev massacre, through the Holocaust, if you see a straight line, are you reading Jewish history accurately or not? And is that something other than history? Which is an interesting issue, which we'll get to. But before that chapter 5, which is all this big, deep idea exploration, you have the Steinmetz visit to Reuben Bloom and Edith and Judy on Rosh Hashanah. And I wanted so you have a contrast, big ideas, and then you have a lot of bathroom humor. And that entire visit is really what the energy in that are these 2 episodes of the father, Walter Steinmetz, going to the bathroom and having to plunge and all the sounds. There's just a lot of energy around bathroom. And then the fact that the face cream that Sabine had bought at Edith's request for Judith exploded in the luggage and ruined all of her fancy clothing. So what I want to do today is look at both of these chapters and see how they relate to each other. So that's our lay of the land for today. The chapter on the visit of the in-laws and the visit of the grandparents, and then this idea chapter that follows. So let me first just canvass some general reactions to this part of the book, chapters 4 and 5. What did you think about the Steinmetz chapter, and what did you think about the recommendation from the Hebrew University. Love any thoughts or comments, then we'll dig deeper. Anyone? And feel free to put your voices in the chat so I'll know to call on you if you wish to share.
Wes, can you hear me?
Yes, Maddie, good morning.
Good morning. What I wanted to say is that I felt like I was reading a script from Mrs. Maisel.
Yeah.
And I worried a little bit about the humor and people reading it who are not Jewish. It was so mocking and stereotypical and humorous, but it didn't paint the best picture of us.
Yeah, so Maddie, I mean, I think your comment is so rich and generative. And one of the themes of this book, and we talked about it a little bit last week and we'll reintroduce it this week, is this a Jewish book for Jews, an inner conversation? Or is it a book that's written by a Jew, but it's for human beings? Is it for Jews only? Are only Jews people interested in this book? Or would it be of interest to anybody, regardless of their faith or their background? And it does seem like chapter 4 is a lot about inner Jewish tensions, especially early mid 20th century, about assimilation. So let me just dwell on that for a second. Walt and Sabine Steinmetz, who are Jewish, but kind of want to keep their distance from religion and from stuff that would identify them as too Jewish, the impulse to assimilate. Does that feel current? I mean, do you know people like Walt and Sabine Steinmetz? Did you have people like Walt and Sabine Steinmetz in your family? Don't be too Jewish. Don't be naming your kids Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Name them Scott and Michael, nice American names. Did anybody know anybody like that? Harriet, please say more.
Well, the answer to your question is yes. We, both Cyril and I, did know people like that, and in fact, we do know some people who have assimilated and they don't want to appear and to be too Jewish.
Right.
But I think that as I read the chapter with the in-laws, I felt that it was the in-laws, his in-laws, he tried to bring them to a level which made them not that different from him. Everybody goes to the bathroom. And even though they thought they were so superior and so better and so much better than the Blooms, in actual fact, were they really?
Right. So let's talk about, I mean, it's impossible to read that chapter without noting that the energy of the chapter is all this bathroom business. So you have the framing of Walt and Sabine are rich Jews in the early 20th century who want to kind of not be tarred and feathered with being too Jewish. They're disappointed with their son-in-law, Reuben Bloom. He's a schmo, he's a schmendrick, he's an academic, he's not rich, Reuben Bloom. And he drags their daughter, their only daughter and their only granddaughter to the country. And so there's the whole judgment of you're not good enough for our daughter. And then in the context of that, then you get, I'm just going to read this and ask you, what is the function of all this bathroom humor? There were the wet sucking sounds of the toilet being plunged. The plunger gave gasps like wet flatulence. From the bathroom came a final, definitive throat-clearing flush, followed by a strong squealing pumps on the soap dispenser. So Harriet, you offered up that the purpose is to kind of equalize. It's the great humanity equalizer. We all use the restroom, so even the Steinmetzes and their son-in-law, and all of us are at the same basic human space. that's perhaps one function. What else do you think might have been the reason for this explicit bathroom?
Autosomal
What?
dominant. I get confused with the autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive and all of that.
Can we again mute, or Joan, or whoever the host is from TE, if you'll please mute everybody so we don't hear that. Barbara Resnick, your hand was up.
Well, it's a, here these people think they're so refined, they're not. It's almost like shitting on Judaism. They come and they're not very classy people, to be honest with you. And they want to, and he wants to show them off for what they really are. They're not being very nice about their Jewish heritage or about anything else. And that's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, so it does definitely have the effect of taking delusions of grandeur and showing them for what they are. Any other ideas about it? You also get the business with the cream that explodes and ruins the fancy clothing. And I mean, I don't actually have, this question is a real question, not a rhetorical question. It's so it's just so pronounced in this chapter. Verse 7, page 71. Walt knelt down and unzipped the suitcase and opened its lid to the aftermath of an explosion. Gobs of whiteness, a creamy sheen over darker fabrics. Sabine shrieked. She leapt off the bed and, knocking Walt aside, squatted on her haunches and dug around inside the suitcase, pulling out clothes from it, like she was pulling out tissues from a box, to stanch a cry of mourning, dresses and skirts and blouses and sober blue, blacks and browns and pinks, all splotched with milky white. I can't believe it. She was plucking up the garments one at a time. I just can't goddamn believe it. And holding each up to let it unroll from its folding and show its Rorschach stains before flinging it away. They're ruined, all ruined. The stupid goo must have leaked. So again, that is just such a memorable scene. And for any of you who are literary scholars, when you put that together with the bathroom scene, what is the author's intent here? Or what is its effect, if we can't name his intent? What is the effect of all this, shall we say, physicality on this chapter? Anybody? It's certainly a contrast to the ideas that come next. It could just be humor. It's a funny book. It could be it reduces people to their humanity and has the effect of deflating pomposity and self-importance. Any other ideas? It's literally and metaphorically sticky. Barbara Resnick.
Well, you can modernize yourself. They think they're so smart, but even with the cream, it can't take away who they are.
Nice. Can I ask you, does this feel that the dialectic that he describes in chapter 4, which is a pair of Jews who made it, who who are in the garment industry with clasps and planks and zippers and hooks, and now they're loaded, and now they want to kind of get away from Judaism. Does that feel dated to you, or does that feel still current to you?
Interesting, dated.
Are the Steinmetzes, as he pronounces them here, depicts them, are they a dated phenomenon, or do they still exist? Wendy Landon, I think your hand was up, and then David Kopelman.
I think they still exist. I think when I read the chapter, I felt like this is my family. This is how my grandparents talked and thought and what they said when I moved up to Boston and sent my kids to Jewish preschool in Rashi, and they were horrified. And I think my generation has kind of gone back to understanding what Judaism is and looks at, 2 generations ago, 1 generation ago, not with horror, but wanting to understand Judaism. But absolutely, I went to school with Jewish people that you would never know were Jewish that didn't want to. And I think that there's still an element of people that want to be, as my grandparents would say, Americans. And that means not necessarily repudiating your Judaism, but minimizing its place in your life.
And Wendy, do you think that impulse, and he mentions this in an earlier chapter, the difference between the generation that said, we want to assimilate, and the generation that said we want to not assimilate, but distinguish ourselves or separate or be who, right? Do you think that tension still exists in 2021? Or does that tension, should we assimilate, or should we be more American, or should we be more distinctly Jewish? Do you think that that tension still lives today? Do your daughters, Susie and Jesse, still feel that tension in their 20s?
So I would say my generation feels the tension and wants to distinguish themselves. But I think my daughter's generation, and for everyone on, they're 24 and 26 now, look at everybody as equal, but yet they have their own identity that they celebrate. So their Judaism is important to them, but it's something unique to them. And they don't, if somebody else is Muslim or Christian, that's great, you do you. And that's fine for you. And so it's everyone is kind of equalized, I think.
So from your
in their
Wendy,
individuality.
So from your like parents or grandparents' generation, it was all about be more American.
Yes.
Be more, not much less Abraham and Isaac and much more Scott and Michael. And be more American and don't stand out. And
yes,
your children's generation is much more every person should be who they are, distinct and
don't change yourself, don't assimilate, don't not celebrate Sukkot, don't not have a sukkah,
right?
Because it's not cool. My grandmother was horrified when we built one. She was horrified.
And what did your grandma, when you decided to send Susie and Jesse to Rashi Jewish day school, how did your grandmother understand that?
She was horrified.
Why horrified? That's such a strong word. Why horrified?
What did I do wrong? Was what she said.
And did she ever make peace with it? Did she ever understand you and Bruce? Did she ever understand? No.
No, we were that family. We were the people. Bruce took me away and moved me out of New York City to Boston as a professor.
Wow.
But that I read it and thought it wasn't just my family. I felt kind of good that it's a generation of people.
Refrigeration.
So it's interesting that in many ways, this chapter is prismatic of tensions that are very deep and very real and very generation to generation. We like to sing. I mean, if you come to shul during Musaf, you hear Elias singing L'Dor Vador. His son David's bar mitzvah is in a couple of weeks, and they sing L'Dor Vador, and it's a father and it's a son making beautiful music. And we like to think L'Dor Vador is beautiful music, but often L'Dor Vador is cacophony. And from generation to generation, you have very different prisms. And I think, Wendy, you've given voice to that. David Kopelman, and then Connie, would love to hear you. David.
Yeah, it seems to me the need to assimilate is alive and strong in America. And of course, when Jews came over, maybe it was a protective instinct. If you didn't stand out, you were less likely to be a victim of pogroms. If you assimilated, they couldn't identify you as a Jew, and then you'd have some degree of safety. Maybe that was part of the thinking. But I remember growing up with a neighbor. He was we lived in a relatively Jewish neighborhood in Brookline. He was third generation of the family that owned Raymond's. He was the only kid in our area that was never bar mitzvahed. They had a Christmas tree.
I know it's me.
Oh, stop it already. Just stop it.
No, I know it's not
Excuse
his
me,
problem.
can we just
Everybody's talking to
can
him.
everybody who's not speaking, please mute and Caitlin or Joan, or Aaron, can you please mute everybody who's not speaking? Thank you. David, keep going.
Yeah, as I say, he had a Christmas tree and they celebrated Christmas, had Christmas gifts. He was not bar mitzvahed. I'm sure the name was changed from Shayevsky to Shay. And this family owned Raymond's department store. And I don't see that has changed considerably over the years. There's still a need to, you want to blend in, you want to, you don't want to go to a yeshiva, you want to go to you want your children to go to an Ivy League school as opposed to a yeshiva. I think the need to assimilate is alive and well. Now, I think it's true that maybe the third generation is now asserting, now that we feel freer and less afraid of pogroms and beatings, that we now maybe are willing to assert our Judaism and our heritage. So that's probably a good thing. I know we sent our kids to Shechta, and the prior generation probably would not have done that. So that's a good thing. But I think that was an instinct of self-preservation, the need to assimilate.
Interesting. It's interesting to think that tension from the 1950s is in some way perhaps still with us today in different ways. Connie, your hand was up.
Well, David said a lot of the things that I was about to say. I find it very interesting because this is my generation. This is when I was growing up. And it's very, very familiar to me. And I think as it's become safe to become, as we've assimilated to some extent, I think it's funny that has allowed more identification with who we are. It became safer to send your kids to Jewish school and to be very affirmative as to who we are. So I agree with David, this safety. And that might not be true. It might be false, but I think that's how people felt.
By the way, I think a modern echo of this, and not to hijack the conversation, but a modern echo of this, don't be Abraham and Isaac, be Michael and Scott, don't be too Jewish, be American. A modern resonance of this, I think, is for our college kids on campus. To put up, when I was in college from 79 to 83, there was no issue with putting up an Israeli flag. And, I'm a proud Zionist. Kids today who do that will get tarred and feathered, and they'll be called racist and this and that and the other. And they're just going to be in for a world of hurt if they are out as proud Zionists. So I think that sense of safety in anonymity, that sense of safety in biting your tongue, that sense of safety in, there's the public you and the private you, and the public you should be American and homogenized like everyone else. I think one resonance of that is talk to your grandkids about what it's like to be pro-Israel on college campuses today. And the answer is it's a tough business. So I think that's another resonance. Anyone else want to share anything, any thoughts on this generational chapter of Walt and Sabine with their clasps and their money coming to visit their schmoey son-in-law who hijacked their daughter and granddaughter? Any other thoughts? I'm going to leave that chapter with a question, which is, in a very real way, this chapter raises deep questions about the American Jewish story, and questions of generational difference, which, to all your comments, those of you who spoke, are still alive today. And here's my question. This is really a question, not an answer, and just marinate with it. Why, in a chapter that raises serious issues that are still with us about Jewish identity in this land of ours, is the stickiest thing the bathroom humor and the exploding skin cream? I mean, what if you read this chapter quickly, what you come away with is the bathroom stuff and the exploding skin cream. And that has the effect of taking up all the oxygen in the chapter, so that at first blush, you don't even really see the deeper layers, that this is about generational difference. And so one question I would, if Joshua Cohn were here and we're giving a seminar about his writing of the book, I would ask the question, like, could you have written this without the bathroom? I know when Michelle and Elisa and I give sermons, and we always share our drafts with each other, one of the things we're always on the lookout for is, do we put in something that might hijack the sermon? Let's say we want to talk about theme A. If we put in a story that's not directly on theme A, and it will hijack. So what people will talk about is the hijacking story and not what we want to talk about. Are we aware that, and very often we'll change up our sermon so that we take out the hijacker. And
I think
here
you should do
he's
is take
got-
this over
he
to
put
tonight to
hijacker to the chapter, and I
Sarah's,
just
and maybe Jason can.
don't know why. Again, if everyone who's not on can please mute. I'm not sure why we're having so much trouble with that this morning, but we'll try to fix this for next week for sure. Okay, chapter 5 is the long letter of recommendation. And remember, the previous chapter was from the person at Dropsy College, which is real. If you Google it, it's a small seminary in Pennsylvania where Ben-Zion Netanyahu actually did get his PhD, and that purports to be a letter of recommendation for what a great guy Ben-Zion is. By the way, the core message of this pro Ben-Zion recommendation was, he's a serious scholar, but he's also a serious activist, and his scholarship and his activism are hand in hand. And even though he wrote this and wrote that and delivered this and delivered that and gave this lecture and that lecture, he was always coming in from different audiences where he was advocating for the state of Israel, and yet that never got in the way of his scholarship. That was the Dropsy College pro Ben-Zion recommendation. And now in chapter 5, we get a very different voice. So just at a general level, and before we drill down, what were some of your reactions to this chapter? I'd love your thoughts on it. What did you think about the discussion of the different kinds of Zionism? The Zionism that said, we'll take a state anywhere, it doesn't have to be Israel, we'll take a state in Uganda, or you just give us a plot of earth where we can have a physical safety net, where we can be safe, versus we need the land of Israel. The differences between Jabotinsky and Herzl and Ahad Ha'am, was that new to anyone? That was new to me. I mean, I got an education there. What do people think about that? Anyone? So here's some homework for you. There's a piece that Danny Gordis wrote 2 weeks ago, and it shows the intersection of Ahad Ha'am and Herzl in Tel Aviv. And Danny Gordis's piece, which is kind of channels the energy of chapter 5, is that Herzl felt what we needed was a state, and that's what was important. Ahad Ha'am actually felt that a state would get in the way. What we need is Jewish culture. And then what Danny Gordis talks about is Ahad Ha'am and Herzl intersect, this literally in Tel Aviv, and that metaphorically and emotionally and spiritually, the Jewish state that Herzl dreamed of and the Jewish culture that Ahad Ha'am dreamed of reinforce each other. And he talks about that in his piece, and something of that was in this chapter, kind of the different players who were involved at the turn of the century who made Zionism live. That was one thing I wanted to draw out of this chapter. Bruce.
Mentioned in the chapters that we read.
Okay, you're unmuted now. Say again, Bruce.
Herzl was never mentioned in the chapters we read.
Well, he talks about, no, I think he was mentioned in terms of the different kinds of Zionism. Yeah, he's on page 82 of this book.
I
In
apologize.
brief, the Zionism now taught in textbooks both here and abroad was the creation of Western Europe, a movement of cosmopolitans like Herzl, who knew little about traditional Judaism, but much about journalism and had patronized cafes. These were men who spoke no Hebrew or even Yiddish, but German, and who came to their political awakenings through the debacle of Dreyfus. And then he talks about, however, there was also another Zionism, a separate Zionism, whose adherents were correctly argued that both older and purer, though Jews could always be aware of purity, this Zionism was the creation of Eastern Europe and the Pale of Settlement, and it was a movement of religious poor who sought to settle the land that God had promised to their ancestors, the ancient Israelites. By the way, that was also like Netanyahu. I didn't know this either, means God-given. I thought that chapter was, I mean, this was to me just really fascinating that this is on page 81, that Netanyahu's family name was Milikowski. And by the way, we've had Milikowskis, Nathan Milikowski, may he rest in peace, and Rebecca, his wife, Shira and Bryna were Milikowskis. And that means the man from Milltown. And Netanyahu means God-given, as he puts it, the grandiose meaning of Netanyahu, God-given. So he went from the man from Milltown to God-given. But what was God-given, according to the name Netanyahu, was Eretz Yisrael, right? It wasn't that Netanyahu himself was God-given, but that his whole claim was this land is God-given, so we have to take it. So there was those kind of ripples in this chapter. I want to come back to me, kind of the very interesting idea that is in here for your thoughts. If you have the book, this is the critique of Ben Sion's history, and this continues the conversation we had last week about the difference between history and theology. I just thought it was so, and you see it, by the way, in modern, and you saw it in very famously, it's alive today, in Ben-Zion Netanyahu's son, Bibi Netanyahu, when he was the prime minister, his advocacy about Iran. He looks at Iran and he sees Adolf Hitler. He looks at Iran and he sees Adolf Hitler. He looks at Iran and he sees the annihilation of the Jewish people. And therefore, even if it pisses off Democrats, and even if it pisses off Barack Obama, and even if it violates all norms of how friends might do diplomacy, Ben-Zion Netanyahu sees the Holocaust throbbing, and he's going to go to Capitol Hill and make his speech. And I'm not judging one way or another. I'm just saying that this whole, that chapter is just the most current incarnation of this, page 80 and 81. So I want to read this and ask you for your reaction. This is his critique. As is frequently the case with a solitary scholar toiling in isolation, it took Ben-Zion 20 years to write his tome. His research is not without flaws. Time and again, Netanyahu has demonstrated a tendency to politicize the Jewish past, turning its traumas into propaganda. And that's what Bibi did in Washington, right? I'm carrying the flag of the Holocaust. I am carrying the flag of 6 million people, and that's why I am bucking the specific directive of the President of the United States. I got the Holocaust behind me, right? That's of a piece with this. What I mean by this is the following. Let us allow that his facts about, say, the Crusader era pogroms and inquisitions are correct. Let us allow, too, that the interpretations he develops from these facts are useful. Interpretations about, for example, the distribution of state power in the medieval era, the ever-evolving triangulations among the monarchy and nobility and ascendant burgher class. Or, for example, about the vast numbers of Jews who, delivered from violent Muslim rule, gratefully converted to Catholicism over the course of the crusade called the Reconquista. and the way that their success in Catholic society caused the church to redefine Judaism from a religion to a race, so as to justify purging itself of the Jewish blood of converts. Fine, good, excellent. But there comes a point in nearly every text he produces where it emerges that the true phenomenon under discussion is not anti-Semitism in early medieval Iran or late medieval Iberia, but rather anti-Semitism in 20th century Nazi Germany. And suddenly a description of how a specific tragedy affected a specific diaspora becomes a diatribe about the general tragedy of the Jewish diaspora and how that diaspora must end, as if history should describe, not prescribe, in the founding of the State of Israel. I am not certain whether this politicization of Jewish suffering would have the same impact on American academia as it had on ours, but in any milieu, connecting Crusader era pogroms with the Iberian Inquisitions, with the Nazi Reich, must be adjudged as exceeding the bounds of sloppy analogy to assert a cyclicity of Jewish history that approaches dangerously close to the mystical. Now, I just thought that was so rich. Please comment. What do you think? And if no one else has anything to say on this quiet morning, I'm happy to chime in, but I would love your thoughts. David Kopelman.
Yeah, let me get on mute.
Now
Okay,
you're unmuted. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with Netanyahu's position. There's nothing the matter with politicizing a thread of history. It is a thread of history. It's reality. And you can follow it right from the Crusades to the Inquisition to Nazi Germany and now to Iran, who says we're going to wipe Israel off the map. These threats. Well, Netanyahu had a number of occasions has said that when leaders or despots claim they're going to destroy the Jewish people, it's not just words, they intend to actually do it.
Right.
So he tried to alert Obama, who was deaf to it, I think, the dangers of Iran and what Iran's intention. They were not developing nuclear power for peaceful purposes. That was a joke. They were doing it with the ideological goal of destroying Israel. And I think there's nothing the matter with that. And you have a historian who's able to link the progression of history to the persecution of the Jews and advocate for a safe haven for the Jews and protection from annihilation.
Right.
I think that's a legitimate academic pursuit.
David, thank you. Barbara Resnick, your hand was up. And you're on mute, my friend.
Yeah. It just reminds me of the story of the kindergartners who got together and they were told to talk about some animal and a characteristic, and the one talked about the elephant and its big ears and the giraffe and the big neck, and one little boy said, and the hippopotamus and the Jewish people. There's always the Jewish thing right there in center for everybody. They never can leave that issue. And there is some truth to what David said, absolutely, about the fears that are generated by the past. If you don't learn from history, you repeat it. On the other hand, sometimes things do really change. And the question is, where does that dynamic fit in and whether it's real or not?
Yeah, here's a question I have for you. I mean, I was reading, to connect this class to last week's class and to connect this bigger question about if you see all these chapters of Jewish suffering as connected, is that history or theology? And remember last week, we looked at the page from the Haggadah, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu v'hakadosh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam. In every generation, enemies arise to destroy us. And we saw that picture from the page from the Haggadah that just lists all of the persecutors of the Jewish story. And when Netanyahu links, to quote this Israeli writer, this Peter of Israeli writer, the Iberian Inquisition, Crusader era pogroms with the Iberian Inquisitions, with the Nazi Reich, that feels to me, again, I'm brainwashed. I mean, I'm a fish in the ocean. This feels to me absolutely accurate. How could you not see this? That you can draw a straight line among all those persecutions, with the result that when when the Iranian leader says we're going to nuke Israel, we take that seriously. So here's my question to you, which is, how could you argue against it? And this, what Joshua Cohen is presenting in this writer, Peretz Levavi, is an Israeli, a Jew, an immigrant, an Olet to Israel, who opposes this. And what he's saying, just to sharpen it, is that this view that seems very plausible to David Kopelman and plausible to Barbara and wholly plausible and accurate to me, that view is seen, if chapter 5 is correct, as an outlier view in Israel. That Israeli scholars who actually live in Israel and teach at Hebrew University find this polemical and politicizing and not legitimate history. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I truly don't understand that. Barbara, and then Harriet.
I don't want to talk too much, but anyway, I think it's very important because it says nothing can change in the world. If you take that view, nothing ever will change, and that cannot be true. And we have gone from being very successful places and then coming to the United States, and now we have to worry that we're going to be thrown out of the United States, where there's so many minorities that a threat against one is a threat against all. But it does lead to a very pessimistic philosophy of life that we will never survive. But we have survived. But we have survived. There have been people who've disappeared in this world, but we have survived despite this.
Harriet.
I can't explain the thinking of the Israeli scholars, but I agree with you. I see a straight line.
Yeah.
Between all those, and in fact, it goes back way before the Crusades. I mean, we have been expelled from countries for 1700 years.
Right. So I that's one of the dangling questions that I just want to name. I don't have the answer, but it feels to me actually accurate historically. And if any of you had, to Harriet's point, if you've ever been to Europe, but back in the days when people traveled to Europe before the pandemic, like many of you, Shira and I always do a Jewish tour of every city that we ever go to. And when you do a Jewish tour of any European city, of 100% of Jewish cities, it's here's where Jews died, here's where Jews were thrown into a ghetto, here's where Jews were massacred, here's where there were forced disputations between Jewish scholars and not Jewish scholars. And there's always, the last trip we took to Europe was Portugal, Lisbon. Here's where Jews were literally burned, in the town hall. And so I guess a dangling question that I have, and I'll put it this way, there's not a single European city I've ever been to that doesn't have a story of how Jews were persecuted. 100% of the European cities I've been to have stories of where Jews were persecuted. You go to Barcelona and you see that incredible church. I forget the name of the architect who's been there, still building it for 100 years. And it's just like the most glorious church. And then you go to Barcelona and you see, where's the synagogue? And the synagogue is in a pit. It's in a dark pit. And it was, and to this day, this is, the Jews are in a dark pit, and the church in Barcelona is, is like the Tower of Babel. It stretches high to the sky, and it's glorious, and it's still ongoing. So I read this, and my dangling question, and then I'll leave this, is just, it feels accurate to me. And it's not clear to me why Israeli scholars reject what seems accurate. If any of you have a thought on that, I would appreciate it. I'd appreciate the education. It does lead to a polemical place, but it doesn't feel like it's inaccurate. Any other takers who want to share anything? Suzanne McNulty, is your hand up? Yes, please.
Unmuted.
Yeah, please unmute.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I think that the Israeli response is perhaps a response to a down position. It's terribly, terribly heavy to view history in that way entirely and then feel that you have nothing positive. It is quote unquote too heavy.
So in other words, Suzanne, if that's true, then they're rejecting it not because it's wrong, they're rejecting it because it's sad.
Yes, they need a different vision.
Okay.
That's as I essentially see it. In order to function, in order to be at one with the world, they are trying to create a different vision, right?
A
or wrong.
different energy.
Yeah.
So in other words, this is, ironically, according to that read, it's an assertion of will. And it's also an assertion of politics, but a more hopeful politics. Like it kind of like a yes we can be part of the world politics.
That's right.
And so it's just a different kind of politics, a more optimistic politics.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Barbara?
Sorry, I don't know. I've been following Dara Horn in the New York Times. She had a column and she has a book out, People Love Dead Jews. In
Right.
which she says, why do we sentimentalize all these places? We all do it, I agree, and visit them. They threw all of us out. We should not look at them with such sentimentalized in a good way. They really have been terrible. I haven't read the book, but the column was very good, I thought, because it deals with current stuff. Anyway.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to bring this home for 1 second to an evocative piece, which is on page 85. When he talks about Native Americans, whom he calls the Indians. This is on page 85. Elsewhere, this is the Peretz Levavi recommender writing about Ben Zion Netanyahu. Elsewhere, he forgoes the medieval comparandum and holds Israel up to your own country, correlating the Jews to Anglo-Saxons and the Arabs to the Indians. And then he quotes, the conquest of the soil is one of the first and most fundamental projects of every colonization. A member of the Anglo-Saxon race who was in constant conflict with the Redskins did not content himself with merely establishing the vast metropolises of New York and San Francisco on the shores of the two oceans that border the United States. Rather, having established those two cities, he strove to ensure for himself the route between them. Had the conquerors of America left the agricultural areas in the middle of the land in the hands of the savage Indians, there would now be at most a few European cities in the United States, and the whole country would be inhabited by millions and millions of uncivilized redskins, as the tremendous need for cereal, crops, produce, and other commodities in Europe would have led to the tremendous natural population growth of the natives in the agricultural areas, who would inevitably overrun the coastal cities as well. So I wanted to bring that in because I guess a flip side of Ben Zion is, I don't know what the noun is, nativism, racism, but a negative energy, a hatred towards others. That kind of prose is not written today in respectable academic circles. And I'm wondering about the complexity of Ben Zion's scholarship as presented in this chapter. He seems to get some things correct, at least in my view, in the view of some of those who have spoken, and yet it comes tainted with this racism, a negative energy, and is not properly spoken today. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and how you put all these pieces of Ben Zion together. Arthur Waldstein, thank you for your voice.
I wonder, Wesley, whether that very aspect of Ben Zion's personality and scholarship isn't the reason why Israeli scholars don't accept the accuracy of one part of it because they somehow have to accept it all. And that includes the extreme politicization and, almost hatred that is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, that I share your question. if you have to take the whole package, then that kind of hatred. Also, by the way, one thing we haven't mentioned, but Levavi in his recommendation talks about is how Ben Zion incited terrorist violence, and how he was extremely critical of the gods of Israel, David Ben Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, etc., the people whose posters we have hanging at Temple Emmanuel, like the establishment figures of modern Zionism and the modern state. He would critique as weak and indecisive and etc. So he was a source of, along with his read of Jewish history, which feels painfully accurate, there was all this negative energy towards others and even towards other Jews who didn't see it the way he did, an acceptance of violence towards Jews. And so I think the Israeli establishment looked at that whole package and said, yuck, who needs it? And therefore, he was at Cornell for 20 years. So it's an interesting, so chapter 5 in the end is the most interesting thing, because it's about complexity and how somebody could have all these layers. And some of the layers seem, first of all, deeply rooted in Jewish sources, like the Haggadah page, and deeply accurate to Jewish history. And then other layers are noxious and unacceptable. And it's all together in one package. And that is the package that as a totality was rejected by the Israeli establishment, according to this. But on the other hand, his son would become the longest serving prime minister in the history of the Jewish state. And motivated by a lot of that same energy, came to DC and created tensions that ripple to this day, even within the American Jewish discourse. This to say that all the tensions in this book are throbbingly alive and well. I want to close now by zooming out and asking you another question that I don't have the answer to, which is, how do you put chapter 4 and chapter 5 together? How do you put Walter Steinmetz's bowel movement and Ben Zion Netanyahu's historiography together in the same book? And what are some themes that they have in common? How do they relate to each other? Any takers on that? Please, Wendy.
So I kind of looked at it in the first chapter with the bathroom and the goo, putting aside the deep and the important with the mundane and the less important and deep. Like what's really important is how you feel and how you behave, and not the bathroom. And I think that this kind of falls in a similar vein, goes along with what is important is a state having a place in the world, safety, security, versus the academic prowess or not of Netanyahu, and just kind of all the talk about the men who studied to give them a role. So I think it was a contrast.
Thank you, Wendy. Here's a guess. Let me leave you with, this is going to be the day of dangling questions. If I were to ask you, what was the driving purpose of Walter Steinmetz's life, what would you say it is? Ellen, what's the purpose, the driving purpose of Walter Steinmetz's life?
The father-in-law. I obviously thought it was money and status.
Right, money and status.
And surely a different kind of status than academic status.
Right. He's going to use clasps and zippers and hooks to make it in America and to be American, and to leave his Jewish patina behind to live in a nice house in the city, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's his mission. And then chapter 5 gives us a person whose family surname had been the man from Milltown, and then became God-given, and whose life work was a different mission, and it was problematic in some areas. The nativism, the hatred, the tolerance of violence, the incitement towards terrorism, all these things were deeply problematic, but they were all in service of a mission. What was God-given was a land. What was God-given was that the Jewish people take this land back. And I think for me, one of the contrasts between chapter 4 and chapter 5 is something that's a source of struggle and I don't want to say shame, but shame might also be a right word here, which is that the Israeli Jewish project just feels so rich and deep and lasting and enduring. The Israeli Jewish project is, how do we create a homeland for the Jewish people? And is the American Jewish project that rich and deep? Now, most of us have a deeper project than zippers and clasps and making it in America. But, you know, I shared when I came back in May, the shame I felt being in Israel when the bombs were falling and Israelis were leading their lives. And then Shira and I just decided not to leave the hotel, right? So Israelis are leading their lives and we're just playing it safe until we can get back on an airplane and come back to Newton. And I wonder whether, for me anyway, as I don't know if he intended it, but as I received it, the protagonist in chapter 4 is a guy going to the bathroom. And the protagonist in chapter 5 is a guy trying to create the intellectual infrastructure for a Jewish state in a hostile neighborhood, which, by the way, the reader knows, Peretz Levavi does not know, and Ben-Zion Netanyahu does not know, but the reader knows, in the end, that his ideas percolated down to his son, who became Israel's longest serving prime minister, right? We know, reading chapter 5, what Peretz Levavi did not know writing his recommendation, which is Ben-Zion's ideas, good, bad, and ugly, take root in his son, Israel's longest serving prime minister. And I wonder about the reach of our dreams and the reach of our mission versus the reach of the mission of the Israeli project. And is Joshua Cohn, is all that bathroom humor a way of saying, of making a comparison between them? You know, Netanyahu might be right, he might be wrong, but it's large. What about our mission? Is it large? And that's a question that I was left with reading chapters 4 and 5. I might be reading too much into it. That may not be what he intended. That may be the way nobody else received it. But as I read chapter 4 and 5, it's an American story. It's an Israeli story. It's a story of a bathroom visit. It's a story of a guy who spends 20 years, you know, advocating for the existence of the state in all of his flawed humanity. To me, it raised some important questions about what is our mission in life. So for next week, folks, first of all, thank you. I'm just loving this conversation. I think this is so rich. Let's read chapters 6 and 7 for next week. And I'll send you something on Thursday or Friday to kind of frame it. Thank you, guys. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.